2, 1.
7 things you don't really need to know, but probably should. I'm Jamie East, and this is the Sunday Set.
In today's episode, we look towards NASA's Artemis test launch, English beaches have a poo problem, and another organ transplant breakthrough. But first, it was on this day in 1837, pharmacists John Lee and William Perrins began the manufacture of Worcestershire sauce after accidentally creating the savoury elixir. NASA's Artemis 1 is on the launch pad in Florida, ready to take flight. It's the most powerful rocket ever built, and on Monday the 29th of August, it will begin a 42-day unmanned mission to orbit the moon.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The twin sister of Apollo, Artemis is the program that will soon return humanity to the moon. Although it will function without a crew, it's a test drive so the spaceship can eventually carry astronauts deeper into space than ever before. The first mission will circle the Earth and then set course to the moon. At first, it'll travel close to the far side of the moon, about 62 miles above the lunar surface, before entering a much wider orbit 40,000 miles from the moon. That's further than any human spacecraft has ever flown.
Ladies and gentlemen, the world's most powerful rocket ever, right here.
That was the unmistakable voice of NASA Administrator Bill Nelson. The aim isn't just to go to the moon.
We're going back to the moon in order to learn to live, to work, to survive. How do you keep humans alive in those hostile conditions?
And this is because NASA sees a return to the moon as a way to prepare to go to Mars with astronauts, sometimes in the 2030s or soon after. It's expected that the mission will eventually lead to the first woman and the first person of colour setting foot on the moon and setting the stage for even deeper space exploration.
NASA's Artemis program will pave the way for humanity's giant leap. Future missions to Mars. There's no doubt that we are in a golden era of human space exploration, discovery, and ingenuity in space. And it all begins with Artemis 1.
Australia's wildlife finally had some good news this week as humpback whales were taken off the country's endangered species list. From just a few hundred humpbacks left, today the population has bounced back to tens of thousands after commercial whaling was banned in the 1970s. Dr. Wally Franklin's the managing director of the Oceana Project. It's an Aussie non-for-profit dedicated to the conservation and protection of whales, dolphins and the oceans. He's spent decades documenting these majestic creatures as their population bounces back.
It was a remarkable experience to be able to watch as the Eastern Australian humpback whales recovered. They're now almost back to the 40,000, which is where we believe they were before whaling. And that's just wonderful.
But there could be trouble ahead for the humpbacks in the form of global warming. The problem for these whales is that water temperatures are rising and their main food supply of krill is falling. With a bird's eye view from drones, marine scientists like Olaf Maynek can tell if they're losing weight.
Yeah, so we're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve, so they're getting less food supply, and the long-term effect could obviously be that the number of whales are going down in the future, but we don't know that yet. I think we're going to see drastic changes in the next 5 to 10 years. We have a stabilization of the population now, and now the question is, how will these animals cope with climate change? How will they adapt to these changes in the ocean?
Still to come on the Sunday 7, English beaches have a poo problem and Apple releases an urgent software update. A day at the beach can be ruined by all sorts of things: sunburn, seagulls and sometimes sewage. Pollution warnings have been put in place for almost 50 beaches in England and Wales after untreated sewage was released into the sea in a number of places. According to data gathered by the environmental group Surfers Against Sewage, nearly 50 beaches have pollution warnings, most of them in the south. What's happening is weirdly perfectly legal. Water companies are allowed to dump wastewater into rivers and seas to avoid flooding. During a storm, water companies use overflow pipes to take it out to sea so it doesn't back up in homes and businesses. But the criticism is that it happens far too often. Despite being handed a record £90 million fine after deliberately pumping huge amounts of sewage into the sea and rivers, Southern Water still says it isn't all as bad as it might seem. This is Chief Customer Officer Katie Taylor speaking to Good Morning Britain.
So we're not saying to customers, don't swim or don't go in the sea. All we're saying is there has been a release. This is how long that release has been. We're saying it rained, so it's 95% rainwater. You then need to use your judgment on whether you feel it's safe to go swimming or not.
Whether or not you'd want to take that risk, campaigners like Hugo Tagon from Surfers Against Sewage say that water companies just aren't investing into the infrastructure that would prevent this happening in the first place.
We've gone from drought conditions where they couldn't cope with too little water to flood conditions where they can't cope with too much water. It seems they're only geared up to deal with a slightly overcast, drizzly day at 16 degrees. So this is an industry making huge profits, billions since privatisation given out to shareholders, and they need to be investing more money into protecting the environment and protecting people and ending sewage pollution.
And Hugo's not alone in these views. Environmental campaigner Julia Hales also shared hers with 5 News.
It is not a surprise. It's been happening for many years, and they are simply not putting the resources that they need into preventing the overflow of sewage into our seas and our rivers.
A new law says that water companies have to reduce the impact of sewage dumps, but the government stopped short of banning it altogether. Between water companies and the government, it's time someone cleaned up their act. Until then, you might have to think twice before going for a swim. If you're listening to this on an iPhone and haven't updated your device recently, you might want to pause and come back to us. Earlier this week, Apple issued an urgent software update for many of its phones, tablets and computers. That's because of security flaws that could allow attackers to take complete control of your device without you even knowing. The vulnerability would allow intruders to impersonate the device's owner and run any software in their name. It affects Apple iPhone 6 and onwards, plus the iPod Touch, iPads and some Macs that run the Monterey OS platform. Joe Tide is a BBC cyber reporter and has all the details.
So the reason why it's so serious is twofold. That firstly, because of how powerful that type of vulnerability is. So this is a dream, for example, for someone who wanted to use a device as a surveillance tool. And there are obviously companies and organisations out there that do that. But also it's serious because Apple says there may be evidence that it has been exploited in the wild by a hacker. We don't know who, and we don't know to what extent that is. But it wouldn't have been. It's not a mass hack against lots and lots of people, against the general public. This would have been a targeted attack, and we might find out more in the next few months, but at the moment Apple isn't saying very much.
This vulnerability wasn't actually found by Apple, but by an ethical hacker. It's a common practice in tech where hackers search for ways into devices and report them to the company in the hope of a reward.
I have to stress, this isn't anything for the general public to worry about. This would have been, if anyone has been attacked by this, it will be a very few, maybe a handful of people around the world. It has to be said that this particular vulnerability, although very serious, it isn't completely unprecedented. These kind of software updates are issued as security patches every now and then. In fact, in March, there was one almost identical to this, and that was sort of released with no fanfare. I think it might have been a viral tweet that went a bit crazy last night on Twitter, which may have made this really mainstream news. It is serious, but it's nothing to panic about.
Still to come on the Sunday 7, a look at widespread drought and the chilling sound of a black hole. Right after this.
You're listening to the Sunday 7. Follow us for your weekday news espresso, or even try our Ireland edition. It's in all the usual places.
This week we've got another transplant story, this time to do with pig organs. Researchers in the United States have developed a procedure which they hope could increase the availability of human donor organs. Scientists at the Yale School of Medicine successfully restored blood circulation to pigs' hearts and brains 1 hour after they died. It's hoped the new tech could be used to improve heart attack and stroke treatments, as well as raising new questions about the future of life support measures.
We have found out is that not all cells are dead after 1 hour. and we actually found out that we can intervene and maybe persuade those cells to try to repair themselves.
Dr. Zvonimir Versailles is part of the Yale research team. They used a device called OrganX to pump blood substitute through the pigs whilst they were on ventilators. That substitute contained blood as well as 13 chemical compounds and drugs to help prevent clotting.
The device is connected to the whole pig, actually. Once it pushes this fluid, it goes throughout the whole body, including the brain. Main point, actually, that we're trying to achieve is to increase organ availability for transplantation. So that's basically why we decided to take organs that were dead for 1 hour and try to recover them, and then subsequently we need to do more tests, but once it's perfected, to use this in humans, and maybe I'll increase the number of organs like kidneys, livers, and so on.
Even though the pigs didn't fully regain consciousness, the procedure decreased cell death, preserved tissue integrity, and restored molecular and cellular processes in vital organs. But while it's been successful in pigs, we're still ages away from human trials. But as for next steps...
So now we are planning to conduct next study in which we are going to try to transplant these organs in animals and see how functional they are.
In China, there's been so little rain that 3 600-year-old Buddhist statues have been uncovered on a dried-up stretch of the Yangtze River. It's the longest river in Asia, the third longest in the world, and satellite pictures show it's absolutely parched. Emergency water is being delivered by the fire service and essential crops are withering. China's extended heatwave and drought is extraordinary, but what's really remarkable is how many intense dry spells are happening all around the world. The worst conditions are in East Africa, where the United Nations say 22 million people could face extreme hunger in the months ahead. One factor is the La Nina current that's settled in the eastern Pacific. It contributes to dry conditions as far away as the Horn of Africa, but also across the Pacific, with Chile, Mexico and the US South all enduring exceptionally dry weather.
It's a cause of concern because of all the climate impacts that La Nina has in the form of drought.
This is Michael McFadden, an atmospheric scientist talking with Global News.
Climate change is amplifying the impacts of these La Ninas, even though it may not be having a direct impact on the occurrence of La Nina itself.
Closer to home, virtually no European countries escaped extreme dry conditions. Rivers all over Europe have dropped to record low levels. In Serbia, German ships from the Second World War have been uncovered by receding rivers, and in England, several kilometres of the Thames is bone dry, so dry that water isn't even being delivered. But in Eastern Africa, any water would be welcomed. Conflict on top of drought has made the situation dire. This is David Beasley from the UN's World Food Programme.
The driest season that we have seen in decades. 4 or 5 rainy seasons have just disappeared.
Whilst we wait for wetter conditions to replenish our lakes and rivers, the World Food Programme says this is part of the world people simply can't wait for the weather to change. Facing starvation, they need food and water now. This is the ominous sound of a black hole. It comes from the Perseus galaxy cluster. Pressure waves sent out by the black hole cause ripples in the cluster's hot gas, and it's those ripples that have been translated into a note. Whilst it's broadly thought there's no sound in space because most of it's a vacuum, NASA was quick to point out this misconception. A galaxy cluster has so much gas that they've picked up actual sound. The actual sound is one that humans can't really hear. It's a note 57 octaves below middle C. What you're listening to right now is it amplified, mixed with other data, allowing you to actually hear a black hole. I'm not sure I really needed to, that's spooky.
This has been the Sunday 7. Wherever you're listening, do us a favour and hit the follow button. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. with the regular Smart 7. Have a great rest of your weekend. Written, produced and published by Daft Doris.